So dear Hebrew University friends, welcome to our, we are all following with great concern the Russian-Ukrainian war, and today our expert will help us to understand it better. I will share with you that considering the threat on the lives of academics in Ukraine and in a show of solidarity, the Hebrew University has decided to offer academic hosting for Ukrainian academic staff and students of higher degrees, as well as scholarships and free accommodation in the university's dormitories. Ukrainian undergraduate students are also invited to attend at the Hebrew University Rothberg School for International Students, and scholarship and accommodation will be offered. We hope this could help at least a bit those who in these moments are suffering because of the war. Now, our expert will help us to better understand the sources of this war. Professor Brudny teaches at the Department of Political Science and History, and his main fields of interest include nationalism and ethnic conflicts, social movements, election, political parties, and political institutions in the former communist states of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Dr. Shmuel Barnai is a lecturer at the European Forum and at the Rothberg International School. He received his PhD from the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. He's also a research fellow at Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism. He specializes in large-scale studies of historical, socio-demographic, and cultural development in East Central Europe and among East European Jewry. So now, please, the floor is yours. And I think we'll begin with Professor Brudny, who will give us an historical background of the situation.
Thank you, Mara. I would like to start with the end and then go back. I want to share the screen. I have a couple of quotations from Putin.
Sure.
No, you have to enable me.
Yeah.
Okay. Still host participant disabled. So please enable that.
You should.
Okay.
Be able to.
Only host. Okay. Can you share? Okay. Only host. Okay. Okay. Now I'll try. It is. Okay. This is a famous. This is the article of Putin the historian, so-called, from July 12 in 2021. It's a fairly long article looking at the history of Russia and Ukraine going back to the 9th century. I am going to skip. This is a title. That's actually the quotations from official Putin site. And that's toward the end. I'm just reading the last paragraph of this article. Just a second, I'll move that. I'm confident that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only with partnership with Russia. Okay, only true sovereignty of Ukraine, every word counts. Our spiritual, human, and civilizational tide formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources, have been hardened by common trials, achievements, and victories. Our kinships have been transmitted from generation to generations. It is in our hearts and the memory of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine and the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together, we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people. People remember that. And then fast forward, the eve of the invasion, a week before Putin sends the troop, he makes the television speech on Russian television. He's very angry in that speech. That's a quotation from that speech. It's found everywhere. Modern Ukraine was entirely and fully created by Russia, most spectacularly by the Bolshevik communist Russia, Putin said. This process began practically immediately after the 17th revolution, and moreover, Lenin and his associates did it in the slopiest way in relation to Russia by dividing and tearing from the pieces of her own historical territory. Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood. And then anti-Western thing, and it's not consecutive, I'm jumping there. And who is the main enemy for US in NATO? From US in NATO? We know that too, it's Russia. It's in NATO documents. Our country is officially and directly declared the main threat of a North Atlantic security, and Ukraine will serve as a forward springboard for the strike. If our ancestors had heard about it, they would simply not have believed it. And today we don't want to believe it, but it is true. That's it. I will stop sharing. Basically, you see here in these two speeches a denial of Ukrainian denial of Ukrainian right to exist as a sovereign state, the only sovereign state which Ukraine allowed to exist in some sort of alliance with Russia. And the current Ukrainian state is basically the forepost of NATO. In basically a hostile territory. They don't say it here, but in other places, some of his aides said, this is puppet government, illegitimate government. And as his former bodyguard and now head of National Guard said in some TV interviews, which was cited elsewhere, he said, this is not war between Russia and Ukraine. He said, it's a war between the United States and Russia on Ukrainian territory. So, and the question is, this what justifies the war. Ukraine is not a state. Ukraine is captured by these pro-American forces, basically they're puppets of Russia, puppet of United States, and therefore we're justified, to restore a historical injustice, which the Bolsheviks created, and B, we're caring about our security. Because NATO is in Ukraine, and if we're not going to do a preventive strike, NATO would strike Russia. So where it comes from, where are these rhetorics? And if you going to wind things back, it's the same Putin who in 2000, 2001 was talking about Russia joining European Union. And even earlier he was mentioning, and people around him were musing about Russia joining NATO. So America was not always this enemy, and NATO was not always this enemy, and the EU was not always this enemy as it's portrayed today. So what's happened? Where the evolution took place in Russia-Ukrainian relationship? And I would not go back to history, how Ukrainian state was created. I don't think I have time. But if you look at the starting point of independent Ukraine, 1991, with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the 15 units which constituted the Soviet Union became independent state. The Belovezh Accord between the heads of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed this agreement, which created this new states within their 1991 borders, where each side respected its other territorial integrity. And in 1994, Russia is, together with the United States and Britain, signed the so-called Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons in return to turn out to be unfulfilled guarantees for its territorial integrity. Russia is a signatory to that document. So, in fact, Russia, before Putin, agreed to the borders of Ukraine and recognized the legitimacy of Ukrainian state. Now, and what's happened when, if you look at I would divide the Ukrainian-Russian relationship in the post-communist period in two basically periods. One is 1991 to basically 2004, and one from 2004-05 to the present day, with some major landmarks in that period. The first period is a period of very similar. Ukraine follows Russia, weak democracy, a lot of corruption. Ukraine follows Russia, adopting similar laws, similar election systems, and they're very similar. There's not much hostility, by and large, there are differences, but by and large, we're talking about kind of following the pattern. Now, what's happened in Russia in 2000, in 1999, 2000, Yeltsin, the president of Russia, is able to basically transfer power to his chosen successor. Putin, prime minister, becomes chosen successor, and in 2000, he becomes the president of Russia. In 2004, Putin gets elected for the second term. Now, what's happened in Ukraine? In 2004, a president of Ukraine, Kuchma, tried to do the same trick. He was a two-term president of Ukraine. He's a term limited. So he wants his chosen successor, Mr. Viktor Yanukovych, a prime minister, to become a next president. The problem is, this is again following the Russian scenario. This doesn't go well. He's not really electable president. The elections are being falsified with enormous, basically enormous mobilization of the civil society in Ukraine, big demonstration in the main square of Kiev, Maidan, demand for the new election, and ultimately, with the new elections are held, and there's a new Ukrainian president who is not Viktor Yanukovych, who's Mr. Yushchenko. That becomes known in Ukraine as an Orange Revolution because of the colors, orange colors of Mr. Yushchenko's political party. Now, Russians are very unhappy with that. They think that Yanukovych is a so-called pro-Russian candidate. Yes and no, but it doesn't matter. In 2010, Ukraine have a second election in which Yanukovych actually wins and becomes a legitimate president. So Ukraine has this vibrant electoral politics, while in Russia, that electoral politics goes and disappears. It's become more and more authoritarian. Even when Putin basically in 2008 cedes the control of a presidency temporarily to his prime minister, Medvedev, but really behind the scene, he has most of the power. So in 2010, Yanukovych became a prime minister, and he really tries to do kind of a policy moving between Russia and Ukraine, trying to get the best bargain from both sides. Ultimately, he retreats in the last minute from signing a very weak association agreement with the European Union in exchange of huge Russian credits. That brings more people to Kiev, to Maidan. That's 2013 demonstrations. Yanukovych, who doesn't want to repeat the errors of 2004, brings back force and police. It becomes very violent. It's sort of a riot, becomes a revolution. Yanukovych escapes into Ukraine, into Russia in 2014, and Russians using the opportunity to capture the Crimean Peninsula and steer the insurgency in Donbass. This is a turning point in a sense. Putin doesn't recognize the legitimacy of his new government. The relationship, while not completely broken, but they're strained. And what you have there, Ukrainian emerges into the new kinds of era of competitive politics. Again, every attempt to turn Ukraine into an authoritarian thing doesn't work. What does work in Russia is as Russia becomes more and more authoritarian as the time goes by. So by the time you get to the 2021, you have two alternative models of a Slavic or two Slavic countries, which were very close to each other historically. It's not an accident, but both sides of barricades stood two people, the two presidents who have the same name, Vladimir. And Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky is not mistaken. It talks about something of common heritage, historical heritage. So in many ways, Ukraine becomes looking for become part of Europe, looking to become a democracy, and to some extent it threatens Putin. It threatens Putin understanding that that he believes that between Moscow and Warsaw or Polish border should not be any democratic alternative to Russia. And to justify that, he goes and basically goes to the Russian nationalist writings in the 19th century which bring him these ideas, the ideas that Ukraine is not a nation, the ideas that is not new. It goes back to the early 20th century. The idea that Lenin created Ukraine goes back also to not so old. It's nothing Putin said it, but Russian nationalism on the 1980s, which I explored. So every idea which Putin adopts is already been articulated earlier. Simply now it serves the person. It serves the purpose of denying legitimacy of Ukraine. For the man, you don't know if he sincerely believes it, if he arrived through sort of a scholarship, which I doubt. But I think what it really matters here is his hate, intense hatred of democracy. There's no democracy. Belarus is a dictatorship. Between the European Union and Moscow should not be a democratic Ukraine. Half of that speaks Russian, and it is more dangerous because that part becomes, Ukraine becomes the other Russia. The other Russia, Ukraine, which speaks Russian, it's democratic Ukraine is alternative for the Russians living in Moscow. Is not coincidence with a lot of Russian opposition politicians found refuge in recent years in Ukraine. So here I want to stop, and I would pass the baton to Sam.
Okay, thank you, Yitzhak. Thank you, Mar, and thank you to all of the members of the staff who organized this event. Okay, so I will pick up this issue from Yitzhak, and first of all, I would like to see a little bit other angle of this issue, maybe not from the level of the states, but from the level of the people and the vision of the people by the Russian leadership and the specific Ukrainian people. But first of all, just to remind, what were the operational targets of this invasion? Actually, what Russians, Putin, what they wanted to achieve? First of all, destruction of the Ukrainian air forces and their air defense system to ensure for air control. Destruction of military headquarters and means of any army management. Besiegement of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. And finally, escape of the president and the government and placement of a kind of scarecrow government, pro-Russian government with the puppet president or whatever in Kiev, and that's it, the game over. However, now we're speaking after 20 days of the war, all the targets are actually not accomplished. And it's natural that we can raise the natural question, why? What happened? Huge Russian military machine in some kinds of ammunition. The rate between Ukrainian army and Russian army, it's 1-5 or even 1-15. So how we can explain what happened actually in those days in the society, first of all? And in my opinion, one of the main reasons for this actually military failure of the Russian military machine, it's social consolidation of the Ukrainian society. Actually, total consolidation. 99% of the society participate in this war in different ways. And the recent polls show widespread support for the president and the government, which was not really the case of even in January 2022, like 2 months ago. Now, the support is tremendous. It's also widespread support for the accession of the EU and NATO, and even in so-called Russian-speaking regions in the south and the east of the country, which traditionally were less sympathetic to the idea to join even not EU, but especially NATO. Now we see 60, 70, 75% of support in the south and east. We see also lack of collaboration Ukrainian collaboration with the Russian occupational forces, or at least even demonstrations of support for occupiers and the new occupation zones, that traditionally they always voted in all periods described by Yitzhak recently, they always voted for so-called pro-Russian parties. And that's the names of the cities that everybody knows now, like Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kherson, Mariupol, Mykolaiv, etc., etc. So battlefield is not in the hardcore Ukrainian resistance area of Galicia, in Lviv and Tarnopol and Ivano-Frankivsk. Actually, it's a battlefield exactly in the territories which, according to the Putin statement, I'm not going to repeat what Yitzhak already mentioned, actually they always tend to be pro-Russian. The Ukrainian army, of course, is no longer the army of 2014. Poorly equipped, disoriented. Now it's a completely different army. And as I say, not only in technical aspects, but mainly in the spirit, in their motivation to fight. And they're not going to fight for the President Zelensky or whoever or the government. They understand now that this is actually for Ukrainians, it's the great patriotic war of Ukraine. And in this case, I think Putin actually is a victim of his own ideological trap that expressed in his statements, in his already quoted article published a little bit less than a year ago, and also in this very long speech before the on occasion of the recognition of the separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, and actually it was the overture of the recent war. This outlook based on the idea that the whole concept of, if I may say, Ukrainianness is actually artificial tool to cause damage to the integrity of the Russian people, only Russian people. And we can ask another question. Where are the sources of this concept, of the denial of this Ukrainianness? And I must say that the roots are really deep-rooted. They are not rooted in Yeltsin year or in Bolshevik year. They're deep-rooted in the Russian collective consciousness. It's not only Putin. It's a widespread conception or view or outlook of Russian collective consciousness. And I can give you just a few historical examples, several historical examples. 18th century, the Tsar Peter I, Russian Tsar, banned printing in the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian church books. Catherine II banned the teaching in Ukrainian in Kiev Mohyla Academy and distracted Zaporozhian siege, so some kind of Cossack special entity. 19th century, Alexander I banned all Ukrainian language schools. Nicholas I reorganized education in Ukraine on the empire-wide principle, which means transforming all teaching into Russian language. Alexander II closed Ukrainian Sunday schools for adults. He also, in his time in 1863, published Valuyev Circular, which prohibited censors from giving permission to the publication of Ukrainian spiritual and popular educational literature. And I quote from this circular, "There was, is not, and could not have been a separate Little Russian language." Little Russian means Ukrainian. In Russian Empire, they even didn't use the word Ukrainian. It was actually not existed. Little Russians, nothing more, not Ukraine, Little Russia. The same Tsar in 1876, Alexander II, published very well-known M's decree, banned the printing and import from abroad of any Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian stage performances, Ukrainian lyrics in music scores, actually folk songs. Alexander III prohibited teaching in public schools and conducting church ceremonies in Ukrainian, and banned Ukrainian theater in all provinces of, again, Little Russia. He also banned the use of Ukrainian language in official institutions and Ukrainian given names. He banned translation books from Russian into Ukrainian. And even the last Tsar, Russian last Tsar, Nicholas II, prohibited publishing Ukrainian language children's books. He prohibited celebrating the 100th anniversary of Taras Shevchenko, the Ukrainian national poet and the guru of the Ukrainian culture, and also prohibited the Ukrainian press. And even, just imagine, during the First World War, Nicholas II, he launched the Russification campaign in the occupied Western Ukraine and prohibited Ukrainian publications, education, and church. Actually, how we can explain this kind of anti-Ukrainian obsession by different Russian rulers? They were completely different. Among them, we see more liberal or radical conservatives, nationalists, and actually pro-Westerns, kind of Westernizers. But in this case, in the case of Ukrainianists, they are quite common. They are quite close in their position. The answer we can find in the Russian census, a Russian imperial census of 1897, the only Russian census, which shows that Russians were, by the end of 19th century, only 44.3% of the entire population. Ukrainians, 17.8%, and Belarusians, 4.7%. So without Ukrainian component, even with Belarusians, there are not even 50% of the total population. Ukrainians have to sacrifice their national feelings, their national dignity for the sake of the great imperial dream of the Russian Empire, at least with domination of the Russian people. And for Putin, coming back to our current issue, for Putin, it's not only demographic issue. Russia is a huge country, more than 100 million citizens, or I would say today, not citizens, actually subjects of Putin. And Russian people, ethnic Russians, they are about 80%. No, in this case, I agree with Yitzhak, it's a question of different, alternative way of political nation, political body, political institutions. Very close, but different, alternative. We can say, okay, 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, became independent, became members of the EU and NATO. But they are lucky in some way that they are really different from Russia. Russians, they can't even understand a word in Lithuanian or Latvian or Estonian. The family ties are very limited. It's not like in case of Ukrainian Russian families, which we have millions in Ukraine and in Russia. And to show to their own people in Russia that it could be different, guys. We are not such pariah in this world. Look at Ukrainians. They speak very close language. We are part of the same empire, Tsarist empire or Soviet empire. We were part together for 300 years. Most of Ukrainians are Orthodox. They belong to the Orthodox Church. So why they can to achieve at least some very symbolic, preliminary, primitive goals in this way of creation of the constructing of the European style state with rule of law, with civil rights, with real parliament, with real political competition. And we are not. Is it a Russian destiny to be kind of dictatorship in case, of course, of success of this Ukrainian reform. So it's a real threat. Not the NATO is a real threat to the Russian political system or the Putin regime. No, the real threat is success, even limited success of the Ukrainian political and economical reform. And here we touch the last point that I wanted to share with you. It's a question of the vision of the people by the Russian leaders, rulers, tsars, presidents, whatever you call it. The question of subjectness of the people as a political subject, as a player, political, social player, not only to obey, but also to right to demand, to request something, and to push forward some agendas, to ask question and to demand some response. It's actually the main struggle of the Putin during the last 20 years to deny, to deprive Russian people, not Ukrainian people, but Russian people, to deprive them this right of the political subjectness. And in this case, again, Ukrainian experiment, it's a real threat for his construction he created for last 22 years. Okay, I give the band to
Thank you a lot, Professor Brudny and Dr. Barnai. So now we are open to questions of the public. So you can both write in the chat or raise your digital hand and I will open your microphone. We have already in the question and answer box one question, which is, can you please explain the place of Donbass in this conflict? So I don't know who wants to answer.
I would start, and I think Sam, who is from Donbass, I think should have a right. You know, Donbass is an interesting area. It's almost was regarded in the history of Russia as a kind of frontier area. You know, that's for old coal mines, that's where Alfred Nobel made his money, which he used for establishing the Nobel Prize. But it brought all kinds of people, and it was very industrialized even before the Soviet era. In the Soviet era, it was industrialized even more. It was a major coal producer, major steel factories are located in Donbass, and it was a Russian-speaking area. It was ethnically Ukrainian by and large, but it was Russian speakers. And from there, it was a center from this Russian-speaking political elite of Ukraine. Yanukovych came from Donbass and others. But it was the interesting thing, during the events of 2014, which became known as Euromaidan or Revolution of Dignity, the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences conducted the only survey which we now have as in all regions of Russia, including Crimea and Donbass, about desire of the people there to join Russia. The biggest percentage, over less than 50, was Crimea, about 45%. Donbass, which consists of two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, was 30%. The rest, in the East Ukraine, was around 15 at best, between Kharkov and Odessa, 15, even less. In the Western Ukraine, it's of course less than 2%. So if you would think which regions Russia basically occupied, and they occupied both of them. Once officially annexed, and one it created this sort of client state, which until day before the war, it even didn't recognize them as independent. It's areas where support for Russia was the largest, but not over 50%. In Donbass, which was 30%, and they orchestrated an insurgency there, and created these fake republics where nothing but a fake. To basically, a desire was to push them back into Ukraine and give them a veto power over Ukraine joining NATO or European Union. That was basically essence of a so-called Minsk Accords of 2015, which Ukrainian basically signed because it was weak, the military didn't exist, but it were unenforceable. In fact, one of the reasons of war, if you think short-term reason, was Putin's frustrations with his inability to push these two regions controlled by Russia, operated by Russia. It distributed Russian passports where people, the currency there is not the hryvnia, but the Russian ruble, to basically push them back into Ukraine and create the sort of a fifth column within Ukraine, and thus basically paralyzing any attempts of Ukraine to move west. Now, Sam, the floor, you can certainly add.
I can just add a couple of things. Yes, actually, until the second half of the 19th century, there were not such name Donbass. The original nickname of all this region was Dikaya Pole, which means wild field. It's a steppe with very minimal population, Ukrainian Cossacks, several monasteries and churches, and several small towns, nothing more. And then they discovered there the huge amount of coal, and many entrepreneurs came, and the most famous name was John Hughes, who established there the city, today's city, but once it was like a worker settlement around the coal mines named Yuzovka, following his name, Yuzovka, which later became Stalina under the Soviets, and in the 1960s it became Donetsk. So the industrialization, very rapid, unprecedentedly rapid industrialization, led also as a byproduct actually Russification of this region. Many people came because it was very good wages, salary, you know. They came from poor villages in the northern part of Russia, many of them, and to feed their families, to gain money. And as a result, the region actually within 2-3 decades changed completely. And it led also, of course, among these migrants were also Ukrainians from the neighboring provinces. But the result was the domination of the Russian culture and Russian linguistic domination. And it was very normal, as Yitzhak mentioned. Yes, it happened once upon a time. I was born in the city of Donetsk too many years ago. And it was absolutely normal that people spoke fluently both languages and mixed them, and was kind of local slang with Ukrainization of Russian words, Russification of Ukrainian words, but domination, you know, with the official culture, the official language of institutions was Russian, and even Ukrainians, they were Russified, almost completely Russified, I mean linguistically Russified. And then during the Soviet period, the industrialization took even 2 more times. First of all, between two world wars, Soviet government, first of all, they had to reconstruct the destroyed by the Civil War industry, and it's a more influx of newcomers to this region. And second time, after Second World War, again, everything was destroyed, coal mines, factories, chemical, metal industry completely destroyed, zero. And it led to another influx of the newcomers from different parts of the Soviet Union, and it created kind of very special society, mixed of Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Tatars, even Koreans, Poles, Germans, all together in all this region. It was kind of sort of Soviet people model. without any specific national characteristics, more combination of all kind of national roots, nothing more. And then after the Ukraine achieved the independence 30 years ago, the local politicians and local tycoons, not less important. It's a region of big money, big money in 1990s, all this process of privatization, the creation of the milieu of the local oligarchs, tycoons, they understood perfectly well this specific character of this region, and they tried to play this game, to play with this very dangerous grenade of Russianness, pro-Russian sentiments, etc., etc. I'm not going to repeat what Yitzhak mentioned, and the result we see even today. One of the explanations for the what happened in 2014 was actually the misunderstanding of the local elites that the game is over. The Russia is different, Kremlin is different, Putin is different. And the game they tried to play in 2004 during so-called Orange Revolution with their pro-Russian sentiments, now it's completely different, because now Putin not interested only in pressure on Kiev. He is much more self-confident. He wants more. And they actually lost control during the spring of 2014. They wanted to show muscles as 10 years before that. And suddenly they understood that it's actually Russian invasion. Yes, I just want to remind you that invasion started not 3 weeks ago. The real invention started in 2014 in different ways, so-called hybrid war. Today, it's no more hybrid war. So the local elites that played this very dangerous game, they shoot their own leg in 2014.
Sorry. So thank you, Dr. Barnai. We have so many questions. We will not answer all of them, but let's go ahead. So the next question that I think can interest all our public is if you could speculate about the compromises that could be made by either Russia or Ukraine to end the conflict. What can be the solution if we arrived until now?
Let's try to speculate that, but you know, I would be very cautious, because I think any kind of agreement, if we're going to be, would be a result of a reality on a battlefield.
Absolutely.
If Russia is able to capture one of the major Ukrainian cities, it's one sort of compromise. If Ukraine stands still and fights, and we basically continue in the situation where it is now, it's a different reality. What is very, very clear, you know, if you look at Putin's proposal, which we know, the Putin proposals, the only thing which he basically gave up from the very beginning till now, he says he no longer wants the regime change in Ukraine. That's what's called, by the way, was a question where what means denazification. It was kind of a Orwellian speech in which what meant Ukrainian government is a government of Nazis, and an elitist government consists of Nazis or neo-Nazis, and we want them out. We basically want to kick out the elite. So now his spokesman said, well, we didn't want to do that. You know, we're not intended to change the Ukrainian regime, even though that's exactly what the operation was about, changing Ukrainian regime. If in Russian view, if America could change the Ukrainian regime in 2014, Russia could do it in 2022. Now, what it is that they can do, it depends again on the battlefield. I think what Russia will try to do is to keep entire Donbass and the corridor which they created from Donbass to Crimea. That's something they wanted to, and get the water of Crimea. So what of Ukraine to feed the agriculture? What of Ukraine to feed the agriculture of Crimea, which is very arid area, and Ukrainians denied that water since 2014. So that's basic. They achieved that corridor already, de facto. With debate whether they were able to put water back into Ukrainians claim that they don't, and Russian claims that they do. That's what the Russian stance is today. The Donbass and its so-called administrative districts before the war, that means much more territory which they have today, the corridor and recognition of Crimea as part of Russia. This kind of compromise, I think Ukraine can accept only with a gun to its head, with no international support. What Ukraine, of course, wants is basically maximalistic Ukrainian claim is restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty in its borders of 2013 and reparation for all the damage. I don't think they will get that either in reality. What will happen is, and if the war stalls and we're getting into kind of World War I reality of ceasefire, where the armies stop fighting, that means that we may have to go to the long period of this kinds of no war, no peace, which at some point one of the sides will try to change the status quo into his own favor. But how, at this moment, the Russian and Ukrainian proposals at this moment are not mutually acceptable. And the battle, if Russia really suffers a major defeat in a battlefield, that can change the balance. Or again, if Ukrainians are suffering a major defeat in a battlefield.
Thank you. I would go to, would you add something? Yeah.
I wanted to add actually a couple of things. This kind of Russian request reminds me the end of the previous year when Putin published his so-called proposal, which was actually ultimatum to the West, to the US, first of all, about their relations between Russia and the United States and NATO. The ultimatum, he claimed it so high, these three, so it was actually unacceptable. Even from the institutional point of view, he requested things that cannot be requested, like decisions of about NATO from the US government. Yes, we all understand that the US is the biggest force in the NATO, but still it's a union. You have to refer to your requests to the union. And moreover, what kind of requests you can do when you are not member of this union. So today, Russia wants something from NATO to declare deliberately that they are not going to accept Ukraine. And tomorrow, New Zealand will come, or Argentina, and request from NATO something else, A, B, C, D. What for? Be the member of the club to use these institutions. So this kind of Putin's ultimatum to Ukraine is of the same time. Actually, all of the requests, only one is partially acceptable for the Ukrainian, not only government and the president, but for the Ukrainian society. Again, it's not like in Russia. Zelensky is elected, really elected president, and the government based it on the party that were really democratically elected to the parliament. So the only issue that could be accepted, it's a neutral status, which means actually no accession to the NATO, or at least they have to show that they really postpone it, not for now. The rest is absolutely unacceptable, because when we speak today, Zelensky, he's a national hero. When he signed such an ultimatum, he immediately, in one moment, became the national traitor in 1 second.
Thank you. So maybe if you begin to speak about the United States, there is another question is, what's your view of Biden's negotiation tactics with Russia? Sanctions on Putin, lifting sanctions with a reported 50 billion to Putin's closest ally, Iran. And also if you can relate to the politics of Israel. Israel is having an ambiguous politics towards this war.
It's a question for several meetings.
Let me start with the last one, politics of Israel. Israel wants to have it many ways. Israel wants to stay out of that for two reasons. One is because we want to have a free hand in dealing with Iran in Syria, which Israeli Air Force. Russians have a base in Syria. They control. They're basically allowing Israel Air Force to free hands attacking Iran, Iranian bases in Israel. So Israel doesn't want that cooperation. The second is basically Putin, at least in Israel, view holds the Russian Jewry as sort of hostage. Israel anticipates a huge wave of Jewish immigration in the light of sanctions, and therefore wants Russia to cooperate, or at least not to hinder that. So, but that's where, if you look at that, that will explain the basically politics of official Israel. Hesitant, looking at both, looking at Israel's strategic interests. But if you look at society, the media, the public opinion is almost 100% pro-Ukrainian. There are several demonstrations. There's several in Tel Aviv. There's a fear, by the way, if Israel would be selected as a country to have negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, that would be strong anti-Russian demonstrations, which would be, of 1 million people speaking Russian, or so-called Russians in Israel, over 40%, between 30 and 40% on what is now Ukraine. So these people have different identities, but it's okay. There's many more people who came from Ukraine than people who came from Russia. And finally, the public pressure works. For example, official Israel wanted to restrict the number of Ukrainian refugees which could come here. But originally it was only people with some Jewish roots. And then they said only about 20,000. And then they removed even those restrictions because the public opinion were very strongly for embracing that, for opening that, with Israeli websites who says, okay, we're collecting money for Ukrainian refugees in Israel. So in that sense. Now, going to America, America, of course, wants the Iran deal for other reasons. And the negotiations with Iran started before. It wants to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and that's why the negotiations were to begin with. Now, if agreement, the way Russia is now preventing this agreement from happening precisely because it doesn't want Iranian oil to flow into the world market. So suddenly Russia puts all kinds of handicaps. They can't sign the agreement, and now Biden looks. Now, Biden has a line which I think is reasonable. He wants to help Ukraine. He's a so-called Atlanticist. He was able to recreate the Atlantic Alliance in a grander scheme of things. Trump did everything to destroy American-European alliance. Biden was able to recreate it in a fantastic way, with Putin's help, of course. Now, what he doesn't want to do is to involve NATO in a war. I don't think there is a consensus in Europe, or in especially the United States, to fight Russia and start World War III. This is why Biden is explicitly denied supplying Polish MiG fighter jets, which Ukrainian can fly, because he said that is one step too far, as far as he's concerned, because that he thinks Putin would not. So he tries to arm Ukraine to the teeth in other ways, have a punishing sanction, especially sanction on central bank of Russia, which freezing its asset in America and Europe, decapitated Russian economy. All the major American companies are pulling out. So that all has to do with American pressure. But he has these red lines. And of course, he wants to prevent the gas prices going through the roof because, you know, he doesn't want, he has elections to face in 2022, congressional elections, in 2024, the presidential elections. He wants prices, cap pricing in the gas pump. So does the Europeans, by the way. So let's give it to Sam, what he has to add.
Yeah, I just want to add here something about the real problematic partner in all this game, and it's European Union, precisely. It's a really weak chain, and maybe the chain that had to take the burden of these sanctions, the most of this burden, it's against the European economy. The Russian-American trade, it's just nothing in comparison to the European-Russian trade. The dependence of the United States on the Russian oil and gas, it's actually nothing in comparison to the European dependence on the Russian natural gas and oil. And especially when we speak about the European Union, we are speaking first and foremost about the German industry. So the Europeans in this case, they are really weak chain. Why? Because they have to suffer significantly most, their economy have to suffer significantly most than American one. On the other hand, the United States, it's still one country, and the European Union, it's a union of 27 members. And it's enough one no in one voting about the sanctions, and the whole construction may collapse. And we know the names in Europe who are really dissatisfied with this situation. I just can give you one name, Orban. It's not that difficult, but also others, especially in Western part of the Europe, they are very dissatisfied with such a high level, with the this wide scale of the sanctions, actually unprecedented sanctions. Now Russia has more, they have more sanctions than North Korea and Iran and Venezuela. Not all together, but all two of countries in this list of three together. So Russians, they have more sanctions, but it's also sanctions against European economy, and Europeans have to pay for this political game and the Russian invasion. Meanwhile, they blame for these problems Russia and Putin, but we can see what will be in the near future, I think.
Thank you. And now I think we can open one of the microphone of our friends for the last questions. I think Joseph Oscar, he raised a hand. Can you speak now? Joseph? No? Okay, so Michael Yemini, also I open your microphone. We cannot hear you. No, okay. So we will take one of the questions from the chat. Okay, I just reading. Would you like to choose one? Can you read the chat? Someone?
Oh,
or...
I see Michael Yamin in Q&A or in chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Michael Yamini, you both were talking about historical sources of the Russian invasion, while many scholars believe that the key reason for the invasion is the misinterpretation, misconception, or even madness of Vladimir Putin. Yitzhak, go ahead. Our daily psychologists.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of, you hear a lot in the media, Putin got mad. No, he's not mad. You know, people said, well, affected by COVID and isolation, he's not mad. You know, you can say a couple of things here. A, dictators who are in power for many years tend to behave and tend to believe that they're invincible and they're very smart. And by the time they reach that long period of time, there's nobody around to say, no, you know, you're not right. So he basically convinced himself, and I try to describe this process, that with his political view that Ukraine has no right to exist, and its threats to Russian security is the right thing. And for that reason, since he wasn't able in the last 8 years to get his basically his way, he decided to gamble on a military invasion, hoping, as Sam said earlier, that it would be a sort of short war, which, you know, all war was supposed to end by March 5th. And we are now on 10 days later, and as Sam pointed out, over heartland of Ukraine is not captured, and none of the major cities are captured. So, but he made rational decisions to invade based on the wrong assumptions. That doesn't make him mad. Mad is often kind of a category, you know, we can't put Putin on a couch and check if his childhood in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad, affected, you know, his way of thinking. I don't think, you know, maybe does and maybe doesn't, but I don't think we need it. You know, he made rational assumptions. We know which assumptions are. He left a lot of trail of his own statements. Never mind, none of them are probably written by him, but that's what he wanted to say. And so going mad is not an explanation in social sciences, you know, unless we really have Dr. Freud sitting with his patient and actually give us an analysis of that. But I think fashion for psychohistory or psychopolitics in that kind of that Freudian or post-Freudian way is long out of fashion in academia.
Yeah, as I mentioned previously, I'm not going to find any excuses for Putin or to be his advocate. It's not my business. Not being his psychologist is not my business too. So yes, as I mentioned, Putin is a victim of his own ideological tramp. And I explained this deep-rooted collective tramp of the Russian people, many of them. I would say majority, maybe even overwhelming majority. But he is also a victim of self-deception. Self-deception, the lies of his own machine of propaganda became after years his own world outlook, something that started 10 or 15 years ago as the very harsh, very pejorative, very ugly, I would say even repugnant attacks against Ukrainianness, of being Ukrainian. I must say you, if we translate all these speeches of various speakers close to the Kremlin and the expressions they use against Ukrainians and just change the word to Jew. And, you know, all our organizations, Anti-Defamation League, Jewish Agency, Ministry of Diaspora, they would explode because of this such high level of anti-Semitism. But they don't speak about Jews, they speak about Ukrainians, but the terminology is horrible. It's just Nazi-style terminology. And after years, all these statements returned something that started as a propaganda game returned and became his own world outlook. Otherwise, how we can understand the fact that the wars that planned for 3, 4, 5, 10 days continues till today? Otherwise, how we can explain that the local population that waits for the liberators with flowers, nothing like this, not even, they try now to make some fake sense for the TV, but it's very poor. It's such an amateur and not prepared, but there's no real basis for this. And that Ukrainian army, by the way, in Putin's speeches, Ukrainian army doesn't want to fight. It's only bands of nationalism. We are fighting against bands of nationalists, kind of Nazi-style militias. No, the Ukrainian army in the battlefield. And finally, last but not least, that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. It's also self-deception. We see now on the occupied, newly occupied territories, demonstrations of the local Russian speakers with Ukrainian flags and the slogan, the name of the city, let's say Melitopol, occupied already Melitopol, or Kherson is Ukraine. Melitopol is Ukraine. Kherson is Ukraine. They speak Russian, but they are citizens, not subjects. They are citizens of the Ukrainian state, and they are part of the Ukrainian, not ethnic, not blood-based nation, but Ukrainian political, very young political nation.
Thank you a lot. I think this was a question, even if we have so many others, but you can write me all your questions, and I will forward to Dr. Barnai and Professor Brudny, and when they will have time, maybe they will answer to you. So thank you to all. I would like to wish you Chag Sameach in the next days, and that hopefully this war, even if I think it will not end so soon after this webinar, but anyway, let's hope that it will be less hard very soon. And thank you a lot to all our friends, and thank you to you, Dr. Barnai and Professor Brudny.
Thank you, Mara, for putting it together and putting the time and effort to organize this webinar. I hope we can meet again.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you for your stuff, and thank you for the audience, and thank you, Yitzhak, for being great co-panelist.
Thank you a lot. Leitraot to everybody.
Leitraot. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.